Vad är det som gjort Danmark så framgångsrik inom e-förvaltning? Det ska vi lyssna till nu när vi ska göra en internationell utblick och titta på the Danish success story. Och den som har kommit hit för att berätta om det är Cathrine Lippert från danska Digitaliseringsstyrelsen. Välkommen upp på scenen.
Right, thank you. I have the honor of speaking to you right after this excellent lunch. I hope you can you keep your eyes open, that you won't find it too boring what I have to say to you. I do apologize in advance. I do represent the Ministry of Finance, and we are not really known to be very entertaining, but I'll do my very best. In your written program, it says that my colleague Jay Wang was supposed to be here, but I'm his stand-in today. He had to go to another assignment in some different country, I forgot which. We're a very small international unit, so we travel all the time, so I'll try to fill his shoes as best as I can. And if you have any questions that I can't answer, I would be very, very happy to put you in touch with my colleagues back home. What I'm going to talk to you about is e-government from a national policy point of view, and it's my impression from my very short stay here at this conference that you have also been talking about local projects, which is excellent. I can really learn something from that. But what I'm going to talk about is very much from a national policy point of view. I'll start by just telling you a little bit about the Ministry of Finance and the agency that I come from. We're part of the Ministry of Finance, and we are together with 3 other agencies. The other agencies, if we take them from the bottom right, is the agency that actually provides our sort of physical IT, the laptop in my bag, my cell phone, things like that. The bottom left is the agency that's responsible for running a lot of administrative processes within central government. The Agency for Modernization very much deal with the government as an employer and all the processes concerned with that. And what we do is we deal with the kind of e-government that runs across government, that is, runs across multiple agencies in central government or runs across central government, regional government and local government. Or the last kind of services we do is the kind of thing that is a standard procedure for which we could in fact create shared services, and I'll get back to that. We're a relatively small agency. I think we're about 150 people, and we were established only about 2.5 years ago. What we do is, first and foremost, we try to improve effectiveness and efficiency, and that is really trying to save money. And the reason why we want to save money is that we want to be able to reallocate these funds to other types of tasks. So we are actually trying to use ICT and digitization to become more efficient. We're also trying to enable innovation through the use of ICT. And the really important thing, I think, is that we're not just sort of introducing new technology, we're not just dreaming up new projects, we're not just developing solutions, we're actually trying to make sure that we get the right outcomes, that we get the effect that we wanted. And previously I heard the E-delegation talk about the whole purpose of actually initiating a project and making sure that you actually get the benefits that you wanted when you set out. And that's exactly the kind of thing we try to do. We deal with horizontal strategic issues and projects, not the kind of things that take place in one little agency or in one municipality. We deal with services and issues that deal directly with citizens, and then we run some common infrastructure components and some separate components and services. That means we are a whole bunch of policy people, and then we are a whole second bunch of technology people. And you can imagine that sometimes we have some very, well, interesting and odd conversations because we don't always speak the same language. But we try to collaborate, so when we speak to people in other agencies, we can actually supplement one another. And if you're wondering which kind I am, I think my colleagues would say she's neither, because I'm not a real policy type of person, and I'm certainly not a real technology type of person. I try to have one foot in each camp, and sometimes I end up in neither of the camps, and sometimes I actually manage to become the bridge between the two. I'm pretty sure you're pretty familiar with Denmark, and I think in these respects that I've noted here, Denmark is not really all that different from Sweden. The public sector is really big, and it's involved in most parts of people's and businesses' lives. That means that we have a lot to do in the public sector. We also have a high degree of trust in the public sector. That is a pretty good combination. Otherwise, we would be in serious trouble. My third point is that I think to most Danes, convenience is really king, and it's queen, and it's probably the whole royal family. If you offer a Dane a service that really works, that will make life easier, he or she will use it. As simple as that. Of course, in reality, it's not that simple, but really, we have come to learn that if we create good services, if we do something that makes sense, people will actually use it. Of course, like Sweden, we have a high degree of internet penetration, we have the actual usage of the internet, and we have the skills to use it. One important point is that the Danish public sector being so involved in everybody's life, it's actually local government that's very much involved in people's lives, because they do most of the direct citizen-oriented service, and they spend most of the money. So part of our job is to make sure that e-government also works in the municipalities, even though we're central government. And as you can see, the local level really has a lot of very complicated and very expensive responsibilities. What you may also see is that there are certain connections between especially the local level and the regional level. For example, if I break my leg, I go to hospital. That will be a regional authority that will be responsible for taking care of me, and also for all the e-government things that surround this kind of treatment that I get. But then, when I'm discharged from hospital and I go home and I have to get some home care, maybe I have to get some physical rehabilitation, it will be my local municipality that's responsible for it. Obviously, it's really important that the kind of information that exists in e-government systems in the regional authority can actually be transferred to the local government systems. And that's exactly the kind of processes that we work on. In Denmark, we have a very, very strong tradition of joint public sector collaboration and digitization. And part of the reason is, of course, that the public sector is very busy doing a lot of different things, and many processes will cut across the different levels of government. And from now on, when I say joint government, I mean central government, regional government, and local government. We have had multi-year e-government strategies since 2001. And these strategies have been agreed by all three levels of government, which means that we have actually had some very important strategic documents that already from the beginning had the buy-in from all three levels of government. And not only did we all agree what we were going to do, we also agreed how we were going to do it and how we were going to pay for it. And you may say it's easy for me to say that we agreed how to pay for it because we have a lot of the money. That is true. And sometimes I think we resort to using not just the carrot but also the sticks when we have to make sure that we agree on the financing. What we also do, though, is that we try to make sure that we also implement services and new processes in collaboration. So these are some of the sort of general areas in which we have shared services. I'm just going to point out a few of these to you because I think they sort of serve as an example of something that we do. For example, one of the classics, and usually when I travel very far abroad, I have to explain this in great detail. I know I won't have to do that to you. The personal registration number. We've had it for ages, and I think we've sort of just grown accustomed to having it, but really it is a shared service. There is one agency that is responsible for running the registry of all Danes, and we all use this registry over and over again. So that is probably one of the oldest shared services that we have, and it is really one of the stepping stones for everything else that we did. Like you may imagine, sometimes we have discussions on the system. Is it really such a good idea? And at the moment, we're starting to talk about security and identity management. And when we start discussing this particular registry, it's also kind of a tricky thing, because if we want to change anything, it's going to be a big deal. Another thing that we have, which is becoming very, very important right now, is in the area of messaging. We are developing what we're calling digital post, which is generally just, it's a service in which public agencies can send documents, messages, letters, digitally to every citizen and every business, and they can answer back in a secure channel. It is a bit like an email inbox, except it's not email. We've already had a solution like this for a couple of years, but now we are actually making a public service. The other service was private, and they can be used almost interchangeably. The reason why I want to point out this particular one is that on November 1st, which is just around the corner, it will actually become mandatory for citizens to receive their letters and messages from the public sector in their digital postbox. And obviously, we're very excited about that, and quite worried, and I think some of my colleagues really don't sleep too well at night, because it is really going to be a big deal when we get to this particular date. We already did it last year for businesses, and we did have some criticism because certain things didn't really work well, but all in all, it has worked really well. The next area is core data. Just like the personal registration number, we have a number of data sets, and I'm sure you have that in Sweden as well, that are used over and over again by almost every single agency in the public sector. And we have decided, it was agreed in 2012, that we wanted to run a project in which we would consolidate these registries, because we wanted to make sure that we would not have shadow registries in various agencies. We used to have this kind of regime in which one agency would have to buy data from another, and so we would have to send invoices back and forth within the public sector. And at some point, someone sat down and did the business case, and of course realized that all this sending invoices back and forth was a lot more expensive than just forgetting about the charging and just getting on with business. So that's what that project is about. Then, of course, we have the Citizens Portal and a business portal, and we have a health portal. I'll just talk about the Citizens Portal very briefly. It collects all kinds of citizens-oriented services. That means that when a local municipality offers a service on their website, they're also obliged to offer this website through this portal. And they're doing that, but we're also seeing now that municipalities actually don't want to offer the service on their own website anymore. They just direct the user directly to the Citizens Portal. The portal is developed jointly between the three levels of government. It's financed jointly between the three levels of government. Last but not least, in the area of payments, we have two very different kinds of services. The first one is what I call the designated default bank account. Sounds really complicated. What it is that every citizen and every business will choose one bank account that will be the standard bank account for every kind of financial dealing with the public sector. And we just maintain a registry that maps one citizen with one bank account. And we all share that. The other thing is, I know that Sweden also does a lot of work within e-invoicing, is that quite a few years ago, we introduced mandatory e-invoicing to the Danish public sector, and we have a system, a national infrastructure that's up and running for that. And when I say national infrastructure, I do mean national. It's not just the three levels of government, it's also available to use business to business. I'll just briefly touch upon our current e-government strategy, as you can see, it's going to run through 2015, and then we'll have to come up with a new one, which means that we're actually in the process of trying to draft a new one. The e-government strategy has 3 tracks. One has to do with mandatory digital communications and self-service, which is for citizens and businesses. The next track, which is a lot more sort of futuristic, is about digital welfare. And the last one is very internal. It's about the way we collaborate on ICT and digitization. The first track on mandatory digital communication, you could say, why do you want to make it mandatory? Well, this is the reason why. Digital self-service is so much cheaper than any other kind of service. So we want to move as many standard operations from all the costly channels to the digital channel. And it is our belief that we have come to the point where we can actually make it mandatory. For years, we have offered this to citizens and businesses. We've told them, here are the services, please come and use them. And to a large degree, they did. But we believe that the time has come to tell them, now, we're not going to offer you anything but the digital service. Obviously, that's not entirely true, because if a citizen has a disability or simply doesn't own a computer or things like that, they can, of course, be exempted. But we really do expect to move 80% of all citizens to the digital channels. As you can see, we have already run 2 sets of digital services that have become mandatory, and we're very close to having to run the 3rd set. It will become mandatory in December this year. And below that, there's the other side of the mandatory story, the digital post, which is going to become mandatory also for citizens now from November 1st. I think this, I'll get back to the idea of making it mandatory and passing legislation, but I think this is probably one of the things that makes Danish e-government a bit unique. And often when I speak to other countries, they are very surprised to hear that we don't have people protesting in the streets, that we don't have riots, because they do think that if they tried to do the same thing in their country, they would have riots. Not because people don't use the internet, they do. In many countries, just as much as we do in Denmark or Sweden. But people would never accept being told you have to do it. So maybe, in the end, the only thing I can conclude is maybe this works because we're Danish, whatever that is. And actually, I was thinking that maybe I shouldn't have given you a presentation. I should have asked you, why do you think it works in Denmark? Because I really don't know, because I just accept it somehow. But maybe if some of you have some really good points on why it works in Denmark, I would very much like to know, because sometimes it's difficult to see it from the inside. I won't speak too much about digital welfare. It's very much about finding out what kind of digital welfare solutions that work, and then make sure that this is what we do on a national scale. And that probably sounds very simple. You test some stuff, you find out it works, and then you tell everybody to go and do it. Obviously, it's not that simple, but it's really what we're trying to do. These are just some of the areas. When we define digital welfare at the moment, we're talking about health services, social services, and education services. At some point, we might find out that we want to add something or take something out of that equation, but that's what we're talking about. Right. I think that this, what I've highlighted in red, is probably one of the reasons why e-government works so well in Denmark. Really, if we do have shared services or components, public agencies are obliged to use them. And sometimes obliged as in we pass legislation that makes it mandatory for them to use it. Sometimes it's part of an agreement. Every year we have budget negotiations between central government and the municipalities and central government and the regions. And part of that negotiation is, I think they would say that we tell them that we have calculated that they can save this amount of money by digitizing this process, and now we tell them how to do it, and just to make sure that they go do it, we take the money up front. And often it works. Of course, sometimes it doesn't work, but often it does. That is part of the idea of if we have a shared service, if we have a shared component, you have to use it. And obviously, sometimes you may ask, don't you run into the kind of problems that a municipality wants to be more autonomous? They want to exercise local democracy. Yes, of course we do. But it goes both ways, because other times we have municipalities telling us what they would like us to do for everybody. And it's really my experience that when somebody encounters some kind of problem, they want the opposite. So if they encounter a problem that has to do with a local project, they want central regulation. And if they encounter some kind of problem with central regulation, they want to have local autonomy. And it may sound silly, and it's really a struggle, but I have to admit that as a citizen, I probably do the same thing. If I encounter a local problem, I want my national politicians to solve the problem. And if they do something I don't like, then I want all power to be given to my local city council. And it's just not rational, but that's how it works. But up to a point, it's worked really well that we have decided that for certain types of processes, we want to have shared services and we want to have shared components. And of course, that is the kind of processes that run across government, or the kind of processes that are the same in all kinds of government. For example, e-invoicing. Back when we introduced it, everybody believed that their way of receiving invoices was very unique. Quite possibly it was. Should it be? Quite possibly not. Today it's not. And today we're saving, we don't know exactly how much money, but our estimate is about 30 million euro a year, because we do it this way. As I speak, 100% of all invoices received in the Danish public sector are digital. The last part of the Danish e-government strategy has to do with management. In 2010, the government decided that now they wanted to professionalize the management of IT projects and IT programs. And you can imagine that maybe they did this because they were not too happy with the way that IT projects and IT programs were run, and that is the truth. We have had some major disasters. So this is actually an attempt to try and remedy it. And what it is that all central government IT projects must use a business case model and a project model. Then, if the project has a budget for IT which is 10 million Danish kroner or above, they must also subject themselves to scrutiny by an IT project council, which is made up by IT experts from the public sector and the private sector. And that involves a risk assessment before they even start, and frequent reporting, and also they have to report on the actual realization of benefits. And part of that is the traffic light scheme, which I've illustrated up here, that when they report, they'll receive either a red light or an amber light or a green light. And for the big projects, if they get a red light, the highest in the hierarchy of each agency, that will probably be the permanent secretary of a ministry, will actually have to explain to this council what's wrong. So you actually have the highest placed civil servant that has to come and explain what's going on with your project. Why is it red? And so far, it's our impression that it really works. It works the hard way, that projects are forced to do well, but it also works along the way. And if you're interested in knowing more about the IT project model and the program model, we have actually developed some pages on our website in English about this, because it's my impression that across the world, this is really something that everybody wants to work on. For the future e-government strategy, I can't tell you what's going to be in it because nobody knows yet, but these are some of my guesses of what will be in it. And as you can see, some of it I've already talked about. It's nothing new. What is new is a stronger focus on security and privacy, and also a stronger focus on user needs and user experience. Because I think for the past probably 8 years, at least since the financial crisis, we have had a very strong focus on becoming more efficient, sometimes at the expense of the user experience and the user, the user's use of the service. That maybe the user used it because he or she had to, but it was not a good thing. It was not enriching to their lives and to the kind of business they were trying to run. And the last part is more public private collaboration and partnerships. Part of the reason why it really worked so well in Denmark when we introduced mandatory e-invoicing was that we actually worked very closely with the private sector, making sure that the kind of technology that we made mandatory, we made the actual open standards that you have to use mandatory, were actually usable to the business community. And we did it because we wanted to receive digital invoices because they're much cheaper to process. But also, as an addition, we wanted to make sure that the business community would actually want to use it, because otherwise we would, well, probably never receive the digital invoices in the first place. So what we did was, we talked to the business community, and we realized that if we just mandated the use of certain standards, we could leave it up to the private market to actually make the solutions. And this is also the kind of model that they're trying to use in the European Union project, which also has to do with EU-wide invoicing. And I think actually, I often at home refer to this as the NemHandel model. We call it NemHandel, the e-invoicing concept, because I tried to remind my colleagues that this actually worked because we made sure it was a win-win situation, that the government really got something from it and the business community did. And I think it's one of the first cases in which a central government agency has actually received fan mail. I have read several emails where people are, it's almost embarrassing. I'm like, no, I can't believe it. You're not telling me this, but they're really happy about it. The users are happy about it, but also the IT vendors who actually make the solutions that the users will use in the end. Because suddenly they have a chance to supply services and solutions that will work across the board. So, you can see part of these points we've already visited before. I told you that some of the characteristics of e-government in Denmark were strong tradition of joint public sector digitization, but I've highlighted a couple of extra ones in red, and most of them are fairly new, and I think they are the ones that we should really focus on in the future, and that is, when we do something big, it's based on a positive business case, which is really important. Then, of course, you can argue, what is a business case? Is it just about saving money, or is it also about providing quality? I think that probably depends on the prevailing political climate. I think in Denmark, we are very focused on the money, but we are starting to include more quality again. And I think that's probably going to be a kind of pendulum movement that we'll see swing back and forth. So a business case is not just one thing, but I think it's probably also always a good thing. Also, that we have this strong agreement that we will actually use the shared services and components. It's an opportunity to save money, it's an opportunity to save time, it's an opportunity to sit down together and think up a really great idea, because usually several parties come up with better ideas than just one. And in the end, it's also the kind of thing that gives citizens and businesses a good experience, which is really the foundation of the trust they place in us, and probably the only reason why we do get away with making certain things mandatory without having riots in the street. Also, I think we're going to see more, not just public-private partnerships, which I think of as a formal thing, but also more informal collaboration, the way we did when we created NemHandel, to make sure that both parties will benefit and both parties will contribute to carrying this solution forward and making something big out of it. And then, of course, I think strategic use of legislation will probably never give it up, because so far it has really worked. It has worked for invoicing, it's working at the moment for making citizen services and business services mandatory to use. Obviously, it's very important to be careful when using this instrument. Actually, when we first made e-invoicing mandatory, we did it before the technology was in place, which is, of course, the wrong way round. And we ended up with a system in which we had to pay for little companies to have the paper invoices scanned and digitized and sent to us, which jokingly we called anti-digitization support, because they just continued doing what they did before, and we paid them to do it, which was really not just stupid because we didn't really get what we wanted, because a scanned invoice is not as good as one that has actually been born digitally, but also we had to pay for it. It was really silly. So that is a lesson learned, that if you want to use the very powerful instrument of legislation, you have to make sure that you actually give people a fair chance to comply with legislation. Otherwise, it's going to cost you, and probably not just money. I would be very happy to take questions from you if you have questions. I have to say up front, I'm not an expert on everything I've been talking about, but I would be very happy if I can't answer your question to put you in touch with colleagues who probably can.
Thank you so much. Do you have any questions? You must have questions. What a great story, yes.
I was wondering if you could mention something about open data. I mean, that can be provided in the right way, that can be a way of making others making e-service instead of making them yourself. So what about that in Denmark?
Right. Luckily, that is one of the things I know something about. Yay. Actually, when we talk about open data, I think we talk about probably 3 different kinds. Or no, when we talk about open data, probably 2 different kinds. The one kind was the kind that I already mentioned, the core registries, because some of those we can actually open up also to the private sector. Not perhaps directly the central registration numbers of people, but things like digital maps, certain company information and that. So actually part of the Danish basic data program, as we call it, has to do with making this data available to the private sector as well. And we do that for several purposes. We do it to support innovation and growth, but we also do it because it's a lot easier for us as the public sector to collaborate with the private sector if we can actually share data, and if they know something about us and the world and themselves. And really there's no reason why we should sit on this data. But that only, the basic data program only works for those kind of core registries that we use over and over again, because for those we can actually afford to do a great project. For other kinds of data, what the European Union would call general PSI, public sector information, which can be almost anything, it would be impossible to open it up using the same kind of project methods that we use for basic data. So for that, I think it's very much a question of advocacy. And that is actually part of what I do. I try to help agencies understand why it might be a good idea to let others use the kind of information and data they have. And I try to tell them how they can make the first little baby steps into the world of opening up this data. Because as at least those of you who work in the public sector knows, there is this public sector tendency to go all in or do nothing. And what I try to tell people is we don't know enough about open data yet to be able to go all in. Nobody can really make a business case for open data in general. So that is why we try to sort of separate the core data from the other data or whatever. And then of course the third part of data, which is not really open, is about the way that you can share internally in the public sector without having any private parties involved. Actually, we're trying to create a little bit of a kind of friendly competition between Sweden, Denmark and Norway, and also to share our knowledge on this and to share ideas. So I hope at some point that we'll be doing something together, because we really should.
Do we have any other questions? You said that you had some major disasters. Like to tell us about 1 or 2, or just one?
We had one big IT project which had to do with the whole system and the whole processes of getting the unemployed back to work. And this big system was dreamt up and developed, and they tried to implement it, and it never really got to work very well. The acronym for the system was Amanda, like the name Amanda. And if you say that to any Dane, even if they don't know anything about IT, they know what Amanda is, because they know it was expensive and it didn't really work. So that's one example.
What were the conclusions from this mistake?
I think part of the conclusion was that it was probably too big and too disorganized. part of the conclusion would be that it would have been better to stage it, for example. And I think some of the learnings from that particular project really went into the creation of the IT project council and working with a business case model, an IT project model, and for the big programs, a program model.
Do you work with social media? Do you have a social media strategy at all?
The Danish government doesn't have a social media strategy as such, but I think almost every individual agency does, and I personally use it for the kind of work I do, especially because, like I said, when it comes to open data, it's very much about advocacy, and it's just the right way to let people know what's going on, and especially, I think, to listen to what they're talking about. So I try to, if not eavesdrop, they know I'm there, at least try to find out what's going on and to learn something and to get in touch with the right people. But we don't have like one strategy. Do you have that in Sweden?
I don't know, have we?
Do you have a social media strategy for all of the public sector? Or?
No.
But you use it, don't you? Sort of individually, yeah. I thought so. I'm not sure it's possible to make a government strategy for something like this, at least not in countries like Denmark and Sweden. There might be countries in which you could do it.
So you have your contact address, and we can reach you on social media if you want to have some questions for you.
Of course you can, yeah.
Thank you so much. Mange tack. Vilken stor applåd.